The senator from Alaska.
Mr. President, request that proceedings under the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. At this time, I would ask unanimous consent that the pending amendments be set aside, and I call up Senator Thune's amendments numbered 607 and 743.
Is there objection? Without objection. The amendments are called up in block.
And Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent now that the pending amendments be set aside, and I call up my amendments numbered 838 and 770 on block.
Is there objection? Without objection, the amendments are called up on block.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I have two amendments that I want to speak to very briefly this evening that I hope we will have an opportunity to consider tomorrow when we move to a very accelerated process. And one of them relates to lands, and one relates to water, our oceans, and how we move about on our oceans. The first amendment that I would like to speak to is an amendment that would establish a neutral reserve fund for land sales, transfers, and exchanges. And before I get to describing that, I want to take just a couple minutes and speak to the overall budget itself in comparison and contrast to that submitted by the President. The budget before us, I think, is a stark contrast to the President's request, which simply pretended that sequestration didn't exist, never came remotely close to balancing, and would have led to the return of trillion-dollar deficits by 2025. The Republican budget that we have in front of us as compared to the President's request, well, far from perfect, believe me, far from perfect, does present, I think, a very significant choice between a direction on energy that I think takes us backwards and a proposal that we see laid out in this Republican budget that gives us a clear choice when it comes to the future of our energy and natural resources policy. The President's budget featured tens of billions of dollars of tax hikes and fees for our nation's oil, gas, and coal producers. It would have stripped away offshore revenue sharing, which is a matter of fairness and I believe should be expanded to all coastal producing states. And I know that that's an issue that you and I agree on. The President's budget also ignored basic responsibilities, such as cleaning up abandoned legacy wells that the federal government drilled. And they drilled these years ago, decades ago. We've seen major spending increases at most agencies and departments, and yet the one area where they're obligated to do the cleanup, we're not seeing that addressed. The President's budget would have done nothing to promote resource development, even in places where there is overwhelming public support for it, like my state of Alaska, which has seen restriction after restriction placed upon it by this administration. And I've had an opportunity to speak many times on this floor about that. Instead, the President sought new programs to subsidize the high costs of his regulatory plans, and he's tried to find ways to avert the serious consequences, such as the weakening of the reliability of our electric grid that will consequently follow in its wake. Ultimately, the President's budget would have led to lower energy and mineral production in our country. It would have lowered energy and mineral security. It would have led to fewer jobs, lower revenues, higher prices, and higher dependence on others. It would have lavished subsidies as it deepens our debt. It takes us in exactly the wrong direction when we talk about our energy future, our energy security. The President's budget would have done nothing to turn around the negative trends that we are seeing in production on federal lands either. His energy proposals are about as balanced as the budget that he offered. What we have seen in this country, as we've seen increased oil production around the country, we have seen the benefits that it has yielded in terms of lower prices. We have seen the jobs that it has created. We have seen the opportunities for us. And yet, this oil production is not happening on our federal lands. It's going gangbusters on state and private lands. Natural gas production has outright declined for years on federal lands. And the president's regulators are now hard at work to ensure that coal follows suit. And Mr. President, we talk a lot about the conventional fuels, the fossil fuels, and I think it's important to recognize that we're seeing similar patterns on federal lands when it comes to other energy sources. The president talks a lot about increasing generation from our renewables. I agree, it's something that we need to move towards. But what we're seeing is we're seeing increased renewable production, but are we seeing it on our federal lands? It may come as a surprise to you and to others in this body what we heard from representatives from the wind industry. My staff asked, what percentage of wind projects are actually on federal land? And surely, given the commitment that we have to renewable energy, you'd expect that to be a high percentage. The answer back was hardly any. Some 98.6% of wind projects are apparently on state and private land. 98.6%, not even 2% are on federal land, Mr. President. And that stat shows what we mean and why we're right when we say that it's incredibly hard to develop any type of energy on federal land. Secretary Jewell said as much in front of our committee. She says it's just hard to do so on federal lands. So I'm glad to be here as the chairman of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee to affirm that we've got a better way forward. The energy revolution, renewable and petroleum in this country, has been on state and private lands. That's a fact. So, Mr. President, I have filed an amendment that would complement language that is already in the resolution by focusing on sales, transfers, or exchanges of land with state or local governments. The budget resolution already contains language for land acquisition and conservation efforts, so nothing in the language that we have included in this amendment actually sells, transfers, or exchanges a specifically identified piece of property. Any legislation enabled by this spending neutral reserve fund will have to go through the process and be voted either up or down in regular order. But the language does specify what cannot be considered, and that's any land that's located within a national park, within a national preserve, or a national monument. So those will continue to be protected. But this language would provide balance by enabling the types of exchanges, sales, or transfers with states or local governments that are often used to craft balanced, comprehensive land policies like we did in the lands package on NDAA that we passed last Congress. So, Mr. President, when we have an opportunity to consider this amendment, a vote for it is really a vote in support as a priority of this Congress. Comprehensive approaches to lands policies to facilitate economic development, empower states, and improve our conservation systems. So I would encourage members to take a look at what I have offered here this evening and what I hope we will be able to take up for a vote tomorrow. The second matter, Mr. President, very briefly, and I know that the senator from Colorado is here as well and others wish to speak tonight, but I have an amendment that I have offered just now that I hope, again, we will have a chance to vote on, to focus our priorities as a nation on what is happening in the North. We are an Arctic nation. Now, we are by virtue of my home state, but it's not just Alaska. We are an Arctic nation. And as such, we have responsibilities, we have obligations. There is activity that is happening in the North Country that is without question. What is also without question is that as an Arctic nation, we are woefully behind in certain infrastructure related to our Arctic. What do most people think of when they think of the Arctic? Ice. How do you move through the Arctic Ocean filled with ice? An icebreaker. And it's not just for commerce. It is from a national security perspective, but it's for a research perspective. It is for all those things that, again, would allow us to be a leader as an Arctic nation. This is not easy for us because icebreakers don't come cheap. But it should be a priority for us as a national asset for an Arctic nation. I won't go through the list of what other nations have in terms of their assets, but let's suffice to say that our neighbors to the east in Russia have over 30 icebreakers. Our neighbors to the well, it depends which way you're going around the globe, but our Canadian friends, the icebreaker capacity that they have are 6. But it's not just the Arctic nations that have Arctic capacity through their icebreakers. It's nations like China. Mr. President, think how far away China is from the Arctic. India is considering building an icebreaker. Think how far away they are. It begs the question, why as an Arctic nation are we not stepping up? So I'm challenging my colleagues. Think broader. I invited all members of the United States Senate to join the Arctic Caucus and understand, again, what it means for you and your respective states, the benefits, but also the obligations. So I look forward to the discussion on the issue of how we build out our Arctic capacity and our infrastructure, and I also look forward to further discussion on how we can do more to ensure that the opportunities that we have for our economic development, our energy security, can continue on the lands that we are blessed to have as a nation, and the opportunities that will be made further available if we're able to move forward with the ideas that I've proposed this evening. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor. I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.